and my grandson are the future of Gilead.
Guess you decided to join the Winners. Now you know how it works. You do what you need to survive. She told me to get lost up. You should have listened to her.
Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel, and thank you for joining me for another video. I wanted to jump on here really quickly just to get my thoughts out on this issue because I want to talk today about something slightly different, although something that I have touched on TikTok, and that is why Nick from The Handmaid's Tale was never a good guy and why I think a lot of people got him wrong. Particularly all of the people who were very, let's say, Team Nick and wanted, like Nick and June, to end up together and live happily ever after. And to be honest, seeing a lot of that rhetoric actually kind of concerns me because it is that, let's say, buying into this fantasy of the bad boy who can be saved by the love of a good woman that often leads women down, let's say, the garden path and into terrible relationships. And I'm not exaggerating. I literally see this play out in real time. And I see the consequences of buying into that fantasy. Now, and I'm really glad that episode 9 really proved why men like Nick can never be trusted and why they are often not good guys, they're not going to be saved, and it's not worth trusting them. Let me explain in this video, and I'm going to use Commander Lawrence as a kind of contrast point. Although I don't think that Commander Lawrence is a good guy, I do think that he is actually better and more worthy of redemption. And I do believe that his final act was very much in keeping with his character, and I think in some ways did elevate him in my estimation, but also was a worthy end for his character. But before we get into all of that, if you're new here, my name is Tanya and I'm a family lawyer and mediator, and on this channel I like to talk about all things related to relationships, from dating to divorce. If that sounds like something that you're interested in, please make sure you're subscribed and you ring the bell and you do all that stuff so that you know when I upload new videos, because my schedule is a little bit all over the place. Okay, so let me break down Nick versus Lawrence and why Nick was never a good guy. And if you thought he was a good guy, then you were duped. You were manipulated. And I do think that you need to really unlearn a lot of things that you believe about love and romance. All right, I need my notes for this one because I just put them all down on paper very quickly. I just want to note that at the time of filming this, I have not seen episode 10 yet. Okay, so I've only put this together in the wake of episode 9, although I'm pretty sure that that was not some sort of dream sequence or anything like that. I genuinely believe that these characters were oft. So let's first start with their origin stories, because I think this tells us a lot about the characters, who they are, and what motivated them to be part of Gilead. So starting with Nick, we meet him obviously in the Waterford household. He is a driver, but he's also an eye, which is like a secret police spy type of a thing. And we learn that eyes are planted everywhere, and they're essentially basically spying on citizens and reporting any misdeeds. Through flashbacks, we discover that Nick joined what was then known as the Sons of Jacob, which was the organization that later rose to power and created Gilead, when he was young, unemployed, lost, and basically a loser, for lack of a better term. He's recruited by someone named Andrew Price, who later becomes Commander Price and also becomes the head of the Eyes. Commander Price offers him a job as his personal driver, but it becomes clear at some point that he was involved in the fight that took down the American government and allowed Gilead to rise to power. There are several insinuations that he was critical in that, but we don't know exactly what he did. In fact, I don't think to date it was ever truly spelled out for us. But it suffice to say, he was a foot soldier in the battle, and later was assigned as an eye. The important thing to understand here is that Nick was motivated by selfish reasons. He was not really fundamentally a believer in terms of the religion, and often people mistake that as some sort of redeeming quality. And while I can see where that comes from, understand that this man was willing to join a religious fundamental group that had its sights set on taking down the government, on killing people, on enslaving women and stealing children, in order for him to rise in station in life. Because that's what Commander Price was offering him. He was offering him a way out of his loser life. Because when we see Nick in the flashbacks, it becomes clear that he was desperately unhappy with his circumstances, and that is what Commander Price used to get him on board. The carrot that he was dangling for Nick was power, respectability, and although it wasn't expressly stated, it becomes clear that women was also on the table. Because if you know anything about men, particularly young men, everything that they do is really motivated by wanting to get women. This is very clearly spelled out in one particular flashback in season 6, where he and June are back at the Waterfords. They're in bed having some pillow talk. He mentions something to the effect of how pre-Gilead, June would have had no interest in him. She would have overlooked him or ignored him or something like that. He would have been the guy bagging her groceries. This gives us a very good insight into how Nick felt about himself back then and how that still, in some ways, carried weight in his mind. Like that the shadow of his former life, the shame and the feeling that he was nobody still haunted him, despite the fact that he had some power and influence in this new world. That still played on his mind. And I want you to hold on to that, because that is actually a really important nugget of information when you understand who Nick is. Now, I want to contrast that with Joseph Lawrence, who became Commander Lawrence, obviously. In pre-Gilead world, he was a respected economist. He wrote books. He had some idealistic ideas about how he could save the world. Now, if you know anything about academics, you know that sometimes they will come up with ideas that probably in reality, they think, well, that wouldn't technically work, but theoretically, as an academic exercise, we could change the world like this. It seems that his work catches the interest of the sons of Jacob, who themselves are on a mission to gain power, but also in some ways, quote unquote, save the world, at least according to their ideology. And so they partner with him, or they in some ways take him into the fold, I guess. And we're told in various different ways that Lawrence was the engineer of the economic footprint or blueprint that underpins Gilead, that without his economic knowledge and without the systems that he put in place, Gilead would have never existed. Because it's one thing to gain power, but it's another thing to create an entire society. For that, you do need some economic system. Lawrence was motivated by ideals, even if they were misguided. He wasn't really in it purely for himself. In his mind, he was doing something for the greater good. And although both he and Nick were willing to overlook other people's suffering, Nick's motivation was purely selfish. Lawrence's motivation was, at least in some ways, less selfish. He himself ended up sacrificing a lot to bring about this kind of new world order. In fact, he sacrificed a lot more than he bargained for. He didn't need the sons of Jacob, not really, because he was a professional, he had a wife, he had a life, he had a career, so he didn't really need them. He participated because he thought that he was doing the right thing. It's sort of a greatest good for the greatest number. But he genuinely believed that the world was at a crisis point and something needed to be done, and these people were the people to do it. He really underestimated the extent, I think, to how far they would go in their sort of, let's say, fundamental religious ideology. So at this point, I think both of these guys are not good guys. It's important to understand the differences in their character so that you then understand the progression of those characters and their arc through this story, because it's all written right there. So as I mentioned at the beginning, we meet Nick when he is a driver at the Waterfords and working as an eye. So essentially he's a double agent. This means that he is basically well versed in covert operations and essentially lying. He'll say what he needs to say in any given situation in order to get what he wants or to do what needs to be done. Early on, we see how he's willing to overlook the atrocities of Gilead. For example, he warns June about her walking partner, Emily. And then Emily gets picked up for having been in a relationship with a Martha. Both she and the Martha have been found out. How, we don't know. Either way, Nick knew ahead of time about her fate, and he didn't care. He cared about protecting June, but he didn't actually care what would happen to Emily or the Martha. And as we later find out, of course, the Martha unfortunately is off, and then Emily is terribly mutilated. She then ends up as a handmaid in Lawrence's house, which we discover was very much at his behest. And this is when we meet him, and he comes off as a little bit of an eccentric character, kind of on the sidelines of Gilead's power structure. This is when we discover that he actually has no interest in utilizing her as a handmaid. And I believe it is later either expressly or implicitly stated that he was interested in her because of her background. She was a scientist. And in some ways he did, I believe, want to either protect her or potentially even smuggle her out. Because we also later come to discover that this whole time, Lawrence has had or has allowed the Marthas to have an underground operation in his home. We also come to discover that Lawrence's wife has had a complete breakdown in the fall of the United States and the rise of Gilead. She cannot stomach the world that her husband has created, and Lawrence, for his part, genuinely feels a lot of guilt and remorse because his wife, Eleanor, is almost like a mirror to his conscience. She's like holding up a mirror, showing him the horrible things that he has done, or at least participated in doing or creating. And this is kind of what ends up motivating him to participate in some resistance. Although he can't openly at this point fight Gilead because he's only one person, I do think that in some ways he was sitting there almost biding his time, trying to figure out how and when this regime could be taken down or weakened or somehow ameliorated. Nick, on the other hand, is very quick to overlook things that harm other people that don't have any impact on him or anybody that he cares about. We do come to discover through one of the flashbacks that Nick was actually privy to the conversation between the commanders about the handmaids and how they would set that whole system up. Although he may not have participated in it, he was still complicit. We don't know, for example, how much Lawrence knew about what they were going to do in terms of handmaids. It's entirely possible that he turned a blind eye, but for Nick, it was right there, painted out to him in black and white, or red and white. He chose to ignore it because he did not want to go back to his pre-Gilead life. Nick does ultimately, on many occasions, help June, but his motivations, again, are purely self-interested because he likes or possibly has fallen in love with June, and so he wants to protect her as best he can. June has also obviously had his child, baby Nicole, but when given the opportunity himself to leave Gilead with June, He chooses not to. He chooses to stay, and not to stay to fight. He wanted to stay because there was nothing out there for him in the world outside of Gilead. And in his mind, leaving would mean going back to being a loser, being a nobody, being the type of man that a woman like June would never really love, because in truth, he hated himself. He always did, and so he could never truly love June. And we see that because he's not truly willing to sacrifice anything to help her. He's willing to help her so long as it doesn't affect him. But at many times, he also turns a blind eye to her being abused, essayed, mistreated. He was benevolent towards June, but in his mind, he was always the one in power. And he liked it that way. He liked that he could play the hero for her because it made him feel good about himself in a way that he had never felt before. So he didn't truly love June. He loved the man that he could be in June's eye, but that man only existed in the world of Gilead. Because again, outside of Gilead, all he was the guy who would bag her groceries, the guy that she would never give the time of day to, the guy who had nothing to offer her. So again, I think it's important to understand the differences here between Nick and Lawrence, and how Lawrence always had, at least in his mind, some type of moral compass, even if it was really messed up. Whereas Nick had no moral compass. Nick was in it for Nick and Nick alone. And these two very differing motivations become clearer and clearer as the seasons go on, because at one point it seems like Nick and Lawrence are almost aligned in what they want. But their allegiance quickly falls apart and they quickly go on diverging paths in this latest season. We see Nick get rid of the SIM card that I believe Tuello had given him. So it's clearly showing that he is no longer aligned with the resistance. He was willing to help them and give them information so long as it didn't affect him, but it was clear that it was starting to affect him with this new character, Commander Wharton, who is his wife's father, now kind of hovering in the picture and looking over his shoulder. He realized that he had to become a little bit more careful. Lawrence, on the other hand, basically threw caution to the wind. He tried to engineer this whole new system to improve Gilead, to try to work with the good that they had done, because in his mind, they had achieved some good things. They had improved the fertility rate. They had cleaned up the environment, so there was something good had come of it. He didn't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater just yet. And he tried to, through his sort of perhaps almost naive idealism, create New Bethlehem, a sanctuary for kind of a progressive Gilead. And through New Bethlehem, they would open up trade routes and connect with the rest of the world because, again, he's an economist, so there's that. Of course, he comes to realize that the commanders had gone along with this plan only to try to use it as a trap, to get refugees who had escaped Gilead back in their snares. And once they had enough people back, they would basically close ranks again, and New Bethlehem would simply be Gilead. He also discovered that the commanders had it out for him and that he was going to end up on the wall once he was of no further use. And this, I think, was the nail in the coffin moment for him to realize that no matter what, there was no polishing up Gilead. Gilead was sort of beyond saving. These people were tyrants, and they were never going to give up their, let's say, power and their control. And that the only way to end the brutality was to end the regime itself. At this point, Lawrence has also already lost his wife, and so essentially, in his mind, he doesn't really have that much left to live for. He did marry Naomi Putnam, obviously now Naomi Lawrence, A, because he was expected to remarry when his wife died, B, because she needed a husband when her husband died, and C, she had a child that he could take under his protection. Nick, on the other hand, married first Eden, who was basically a child bride, and he treated her really poorly. He was mean and dismissive to her, and he didn't even try to protect her when she was running around with the guardian. Now, it's not that he deliberately hurt her, but it was through more his carelessness that he was, in a sense, mean and cruel to her. Because the thing you have to understand is for men like Nick, they're only ever interested in women that they may potentially have a relationship with. Eden, he was not interested in having a relationship with her, which, I mean, in some ways is to his credit because she was obviously very young. So kudos to him for that. But because he wasn't interested in having any relationship with her, essentially to him, it was almost like she didn't exist, / she was almost a burden. And that's the thing to understand about men like Nick. He will be nice and kind only when it serves him, only when he is getting something in return. Like in the case of June, he's getting obviously a physical relationship, but also that emotional validation and that ego boost that comes along with being in a relationship with her, having that power over her, having that sort of hero complex, that hero role that he can play. He would get no benefit from being kind to Eden, and so he wasn't. And then he later marries another woman, and again, he's not very nice to her. Although it's clear they do have a relationship and she falls pregnant, it's almost like he's doing that as part of his duty and to cement his power, because you can see that this ambition has taken over. As soon as he became a commander, now he was pulled in two different directions. The resistance on the one hand and a potential rise to power on the other. And this was the thing that he struggled with, because yes, he might have loved June, and yes, he might have helped her, but he never did it at the expense of his rise to power. And at the point where he had to choose between his position in Gilead and June, he chose Gilead. And that should not have been a surprise to anybody. You see, when Nick was backed into a corner, he told Commander Wharton that there was a plan on foot at Jezebel's as a way of explaining why he was there. But he could have, at that moment, decided to give them misinformation or give them some different information or make up some other reason. He could have taken the personal hit and said that he was there having a relationship or stepping out on his wife, but this was his wife's father. So it would have caused problems for him to say that he was at Jezebel's for Jezebel's. You see what I mean? So instead he chose to take the route that would simultaneously improve his standing with his father-in-law and give him more power. And it came at the expense of all of those women, and he did not care. He didn't apologize and he didn't feel any remorse. In his mind, he was just doing what he had to do to survive. That's the price you pay. Even though there were other things that he could have done that would have had a personal consequence to him, but would have meant saving those women. He chose himself. That is on brand for Nick. Nick always chooses Nick. That is who he aligns himself with. And Nick will always choose whatever side is going to be more beneficial for him. And that's the thing that I think so many people missed about him. They believed that he could be redeemed. But the truth is, in order for Nick to redeem himself, he would have had to be willing to make a personal sacrifice and to lose power and position and potentially go back to being a nobody. It wasn't even about sacrificing his life. He was not willing to sacrifice his position. For Lawrence, on the other hand, he had every opportunity to chase power and position and influence. He was the architect of Gilead's economy, as I said, and yet we meet him, at the beginning of the show, he's kind of almost on the fringes of the power structure. He didn't exactly position himself in the middle of it. He wasn't in DC, he wasn't on the High Council. There were a lot of things that he probably could have done that put him really in a position of much higher power, but he had no interest in that. And in the end, he's a reluctant hero, but he becomes a hero because he realizes that this is the right thing to do. And again, that's very on brand for him. He chooses what he thinks is the most correct decision at the time. Even if in the past, some of those decisions led to terrible outcomes. In his mind, he was always doing it for some greater good, for some purpose, not just for himself. And so it makes perfect sense that he would sacrifice himself to take down that plane of commanders. In that season 9 episode where they come together, it's like they're side by side and yet their paths have diverged so greatly. And Nick very clearly expresses to Lawrence that he is glad to see he chose the winning side, suggesting that Nick knew what he was doing. He had decided that Gilead was the side that was going to give him the most benefit, that June essentially was out of the picture in his mind, so he couldn't be with her anymore. So what was the point of helping the resistance? He could kind of see clearly a path forward that would lead to him rising in power again, because now there's a rebellion on foot. He's married to an important commander's daughter. They're about to have a son. And it's like, oh, okay, cool. I can go to DC and I can position myself right in the heart of power. And he took that because that was the decision that in his mind would lead to the greatest benefit for Nick. And Lawrence's decision was the decision that led to, again, the greatest benefit for the greatest people, or the greater good. And so although they both sat there side by side and although they faced the same fate, I feel like they came to it from completely different angles. And Nick's downfall was, in my opinion, the perfect lesson to learn here. That men like Nick are not good guys. When a man is purely motivated by selfish and self-interest, it doesn't matter how nice he is to you or how nice he is to the people he, quote unquote, cares about. Because when push comes to shove, if he has to make a difficult choice, he will always make the choice that he perceives to be the most beneficial to him, and he will not care about the consequences to anybody else, particularly not if they're not somebody that he personally cares about. And this is the danger of falling into the trap of believing that guys like Nick, who are damaged and broken, can be fixed or they can be redeemed, because that is not a redeemable quality. Just because he is willing to do nice things for a woman that he is interested in, that he has had some romantic interest in, that doesn't mean that he is a good guy. Because usually what happens in those situations is that as soon as that woman either rejects him or circumstances are such that they can no longer be together, he will turn on her in an instant. And he will not even think twice about it. Or in other situations, if another better opportunity comes along, like if he's no longer interested in that woman and there's another woman in the picture, he will leave and run off with that other woman if he perceives that that is going to be better for him, whether it's better for him professionally, personally, whatever. She's younger, she's prettier. That's the guy that Nick is in reality. And while Lawrence is not a good guy either, and is equally dangerous, and is equally responsible for all of the atrocities in Gilead, I can see why he had a redemption arc when Nick didn't. Because at least his motivations were not solely about himself, his ego, his position, his power. They were actually trying to do something good. And although they say that the road to hell is paved on good intentions, at least Lawrence's good intentions in the end led him on the right path. So that's all I had for you today. Like I said, this was a little bit impromptu, so my thoughts were a little bit all over the place, but I just wanted to get this out. Now I'm going to go watch episode 10. I have no idea what's going to happen, but I look forward to it. If you guys enjoyed this, please let me know in the comments below. Were you Team Nick? Were you disappointed by his downfall? Or, like me, were you glad to see it or not surprised at all? I always love hearing from you, so definitely let me know your thoughts. And as always, I'll see you in the next one. Enjoy the rest of your day wherever you are in this crazy world. Bye for now.